Hello and welcome. I'm the Rambling Director, and today I just watched Babylon. I went with a friend to see this. It's a new movie by Damien Chazelle, the director of La La Land, a director whom pretty much everything I've seen of his, I've really loved. There's been very few things that he's made where I've been like, yeah, that's kind of a miss the mark sort of thing. Most everything I've seen, personally, I've loved. So, going into Babylon, I was really excited about this prospect because I love silent movies, and I love the silent era. And so going into a film that was all about the transition from talkies to silent films. So like the actors in the silent film era, a lot of people don't know this, but many of them could not make the cut, because once you heard them speak, it just ruined everything. You know, they were beautiful people, they were interesting to watch on camera, maybe they were even great in terms of physicality of acting, but people like, for instance, Mary Philbin was a big name, and when you heard her speak in her real voice, you just realized this was not going to work out, and that's what this is really about. So, Margot Robbie plays an up-and-coming party girl, party animal, goes to Hollywood elite parties and getting plastered, getting drugged out of her mind. She meets this guy named Manny, who is a Hispanic immigrant who wants to become a bigwig, a big powerful person behind the scenes. He wants to be a producer, an executive. He wants to be one of the people who runs Hollywood. Now, those are your two main characters, which surprised me a little bit because I thought Brad Pitt would be like a bigger character. And he is a big character. This is really an ensemble piece, but truthfully, Manny and Nellie are the two stars of the film. And then Jack Conrad, Brad Pitt's character, is a huge silent film star. He is sort of like the Lon Chaney of this universe, you know. He's bigwigging with like Greta Garbo and people who are recognizable names, even if you don't know a lot about the silent era. And it's really cool to see how he has this sort of like this Sunset Boulevard sort of a story arc where he's realizing that his power and influence and who he was in Hollywood is no longer who he can remain because sound has changed everything. And this is a real irony because when we first meet him, he's talking to Manny about how, yes, we need to change the form. We need to change the way films are made. There's got to be something that'll, you know, a higher calling that we Hollywood people are called to. You know, that when we direct and produce these movies, we should be making high art. And he, in fact, is engaged to this woman at one point who says film is a lower art form, and he gives her the grilling of a lifetime. It's a fantastically scripted scene. So, overall, I really loved this movie. Now, let me just say before I go any further with that, I know that this movie is getting a lot of hate, but much like Amsterdam, this is one of those films that I feel like 20 years from like down the road from us, our kids are gonna look at this and be like, this is like the shit, you know, like this is the movie. I feel like this was a film made for people who love movies. And if you are a casual film person, which is what most reviewers and critics are, let's be real, most critics are not Roger Ebert, you know, somebody who eats and breathes film. Most people are not like that who review films. Now, I'm not a critic. I say that in all my videos that I do this sort of thing, or I try to. I don't say it in every one of them, but I try to point out that I am a reviewer. Okay, I will give you my honest thought. My idea is never to critique something because I'm a director, not a critic. And it would be weird of me to criticize people that are my colleagues, you know, and I aspire for them to be my colleagues. So I'm not gonna sit here and tell you, oh, the movie, blah, 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 blah. If I didn't really love this movie, I would not have made a video about it. I loved this film from start to finish. There was one major flaw in it as far as like my personal taste, but it might not be something that bothers you. This is a movie that was made for people who love film. Now, at first, I started hearing lines and stuff where I was like, do they realize how close this plot was to Singing in the Rain, and are they deliberately using lines from Singing in the Rain? And by the end, they show you that yes, in fact, the whole idea was to say, as we all know, that Singing in the Rain was based on things that really happened in a loose way. But this was to say that the Hollywood legend that sprang up around these real people influenced the making of Singing in the Rain. And that's a really clever way of tying history in together with fiction. Now, I don't want to give any spoilers because I highly recommend you see this. There's two things that I will say. This is a criticism that I could lob against almost every movie made. This film is too long. Let's just be real here. Over 3 hours is a long time. And every movie getting made now is like 3.5 hours. And I'm like, did Black Panther 2 really need to be 3 hours? No. Did this need to be 3 hours? No, you could have cut this down. Seriously cut it down. That being said, I loved it as it was. Now, that just means that, like Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet, which is 4 hours long, if I'm going to watch this, it's something I'd have to invest my time in. Set aside a day and say, hey, I really want to watch Babylon, and I'm going to go watch it. Much like Amsterdam as well. And there were a lot of comparisons between those movies, but this film, this felt much tighter. There was a lot of times where I was like, man, how did we get from there to here? But it was in a good way. Where Amsterdam lollygagged a lot, this movie always feels like something's happening. It's just that the things happening are not always things that are important to the plot. So I'll give you an example. Margot Robbie's character, her dad is her business agent, and he's always telling girls how he fought a rattlesnake to impress them. Well, at one point, Robbie's just like, hey, who wants to go see my dad fight a rattlesnake right now? So they all drive out into the desert. Well, her dad obviously never fought a rattlesnake, and he's a chicken, and so he starts babbling, almost like he's having a stroke, then he passes out. Well, then Margot Robbie is like, hey, you pussies, you go and fight the snake, and none of the men will do it because they're smart enough to realize they can't take on a rattlesnake. Well, then Margot Robbie is just like, well, you know what? I'm more man than all of you. Picks up the snake and starts shaking it around. Then the rattlesnake fastens onto her neck. She is running around with a rattlesnake flapping off her neck. Everybody starts running in circles, screaming bloody murder. And all the while, Brad Pitt's character is standing there, watching all of this in slow motion with the expression of like, man, isn't life beautiful? As a single tear rolls down his face. Then his wife is like, do something, Jack. And he's like, all right, I'll do something. He runs towards Margot Robbie to save her and gets hit by a car. Then Margot Robbie has this like love interest who is a woman. No, she's not gay. Margot Robbie's not gay. She's just interested in this woman for like 5 minutes of the movie, and then it goes away and it's never really mentioned again. So she comes up, cuts the head off the snake, takes the snake head off of Margot, sucks the venom out with her mouth, pours some like brandy or something on her, and when Margot Robbie wakes up and has lived through the experience, the two girls start making out. None of that serves any purpose to the film. But my gosh, if it is not one hell of a scene. And it is so much fun. There's a lot of stuff like that. I really enjoy certain elements. I'll say one other thing. This movie, when it started, I thought, there's no way I can make a review about this. I am not going to like this. It starts off with a character transporting an elephant to a party. And he keeps having to promise people favors in order to get them to get the elephant to the party. And the elephant starts defecating all over them and all over the camera. That sort of thing is a little bit much for me, especially if that's your opening handshake to the movie. I feel like the movie made a very bad first impression in that scene when it could have been cut much shorter. And if it had been cut shorter, I think it would have been funnier. For instance, if he'd just shown up at the party with the elephant after you kind of got what the joke was, and he had like 100 people with him, and they were like, who's all these people? And he was like, just don't ask. You don't want to know. That would have been funnier because whatever we'd imagined would be funnier than whatever you could show us. So there's a little couple things like that. Not really enough to mention, but the fact that it was your opening, it did put a bit of a bad taste in my mouth personally. However, by the time we were 30 minutes into the movie, and the opening title does not appear until you're like 35 minutes into the movie, it had me hooked. You completely could have shown me almost anything at that point. It would have been hard for me to have left the theater. At the very least, I wanted to stay and see what else happened. So that was pretty fun. I thought it was an interesting element of the movie that, like, after that first scene, everything else is crazy. So you go from an elephant defecating on somebody to a woman urinating on a man. Then you go into this wild party scene, which is all done fabulously in one shot. The cinematography is exceptional in this movie. And there's just... I probably saw 100 different individual people nude. There is full frontal male and female nudity in this, and it is incredibly sexualized. The funny thing is, it does almost everything in its power. It uses almost every camera trick possible to make nudity as unerotic as you can imagine it being. It's really not arousing. It's just crazy. And this Hollywood party is, like, incredibly over the top. And it lasts, like I said, like 30 minutes of the movie. And in this party, we're introduced to everybody and their chief motivations throughout the film. There's also some great moments where, when Brad Pitt invites, Jack Conrad invites Manny to go with him and be part of a film. And when we get there, we see that there's like 12 silent movies all being shot on the back lot at the same time. And because there's no sound, everybody's talking over everybody else. And when you talk about, like, a magical period in movies where things really happened and people got down to work and did this like a job, there's very few better ways I think you could represent it. Is it entirely accurate? No, it's entirely dramatized. But when you see hundreds of extras really going at it, acting like they're in a war, there's just no comparison for it. It's very, very practical. And there's like this point where Margot Robbie's in this set, and a set's right next door, and it bursts into flames, and they're just keep filming, keep the cameras rolling at all costs. Gosh, it was so much fun. And there were so many director characters in this that I really sympathized with. There's this great scene where, after they shift to sound, Margot Robbie's character is just trying to hit her mark and do her scene. But she has all these lines that she's never had to memorize before. She has to hit exact marks to be under the microphone, because the mics didn't move. And it's like 7 or 8 takes, and we see it in real time. And they had to turn off the air conditioning because it's too loud for the sound guys. So they are pouring sweat. And after 8 takes, when she finally nails it, they knock on the sound box that has been put around the camera so that the camera's noise wouldn't mess with the sound. And the cameraman has died because he overheated in the box. That sort of thing is not just hilarious, although it is. It also gives you a real sense of this time period being very unforgiving. This movie has several scenes in it where it seems pretty innocuous, but there's a friggin' body count. Like, during the scene where they're just pretending to have a war, people are being bandaged up like they're part of a real war because they're all getting hurt because there was no actors' unions. And there's one point where a guy just has a spear jabbed through his chest, and everybody looks at each other and they're like, well, he did have a drinking problem. He probably fell on it. What do you say to such madness? I loved this movie. This was an A+ movie for me. A+ hard. This was an exceptionally well-made movie, an exceptionally well-acted movie. If, again, I wanted to save it to the end, I did have one thing, and it's a spoiler, so I saved it to the end. I do have one thing that was an issue for me. The ending, when Manny comes in and he watches the movie Singing in the Rain, and he realizes that it is based on his own experiences and the people he knew personally, and that it's being portrayed as a comedy rather than the tragedy it really was, he begins to cry. When this happens, they cut into a montage of films all the way from the silent period to Avatar. So modern movies with a lot of CGI. And It has this strobing red and blue screen. I thought I was going to have a seizure at one point. And when it finishes this big montage of what film has become, it cuts back in to Manny in the theater crying, and that's where the movie ends. Now, I liked that ending. That montage was too much. It held our hands as an audience. It was a little too afraid we weren't going to get it. And it was also trying a little too hard to be 2001: A Space Odyssey. In fact, it actually ends with the final 3 or 4 notes of Also Sprach Zarathustra. And that was not the movie that we saw for the other 2.5 hours. So that was a little disappointing to me. I would have liked to have seen a lot more in that, a lot more ambiguity, where we see the scenes and maybe we have to pick it out ourselves and realize what the lines were doing in the movie. You know, I think that would have probably been stronger. And if that montage had been either much, much shorter or just completely removed, and he realized, you know, that their contribution to film, it was bigger than himself. He was part of something bigger than himself like he wanted, and his contribution will live on throughout the entirety of film history. That, I think, would have been a better ending. But that being said, I loved the idea of that ending. I just didn't think the execution was perfect. I thought it fell apart a little bit. But it is a swell idea for an ending. I mean, really, really works for this type of film. Some of the scenes that I loved the most, however, were the scenes that were a little more in your face. I really loved the gossip article writer who gives Brad Pitt's character a little speech where she says, you know what, you might feel bad that your moment in the sun is over. But just remember that when all of these old films are opened up, when they find these old films in the vault, 100 years down the road, and they rediscover classic movies, you are going to touch some kid in a way that is going to make him feel like he knows you, like you're friends, like he went on this adventure with you. And that's a beautiful blessing that you've been given as an actor, that you will forever be somebody's hope, somebody's moment of escape. I thought that was a really beautiful moment. So that is all I've got for today. This might be the best film I've seen this year. I loved Amsterdam. I loved Elvis. Maybe I'll do a video about my favorite films from 2022. But just overall, Babylon is one of the best films of the year. I don't care how many people hate on it. This film is an exceptional film. Is it everybody's cup of tea? No, but I wouldn't call Once Upon a Time in Hollywood bad movies because they're not my cup of tea. I can express the fact that they are great movies, they just don't get me. Babylon entirely got me. So, overall, A+. Absolutely fantastic movie. And if you love Hollywood history, you love this sort of time period, and you're willing to accept a few discrepancies to have a really fun plot that ranges from comedy to suspense at moments to outright tragedy by the end, then I think you will find a lot to be enjoyed in this film. So thank you everybody for watching this review, and I hope you have a great night and a Happy New Year.